At this point, Ike had to argue with Monty about the boundary line dividing the Americans from the British, because Patton had gone over into Monty's territory, enclosing the Falaise Gap, and Monty would still be in command of the Americans for 10 more days, and had big plans drawn up that included ordering the Americans to march into Paris. And some historians said that Monty had seasoned troops held in reserve that he could have sent to help the Canadians rather than just complaining about their poor performance. Patton was supposed to have stopped at Argenton, 12 miles south of Falaise. And Falaise was 20 miles south of Caen, and the Seine River was 70 miles away, and Paris was 100 miles away. And Patton told Bradley, "Instead of waiting here for Monty, we ought to get moving again. There's nothing out front, nothing at all between me and the Seine." Bradley, page 374. Hayslip had scarcely started down that Seine River crossing when Montgomery called to propose that we extend our pincer from Argenton northeast to Chambois. Monty had already diverted his Polish armored division toward that objective with a view to closing the trap there. "I agree with you, sir," I told Monty. "We ought to go northeast. In fact, I've just sent 2 divisions northeast to the Seine." Mantes Gaucourt was 75 miles farther east than Montgomery's objective at Chambois. While Monty caught his breath at the other end of the line, the liberation of France lay only days away. Between the Orne and the Seine, a German force still blocked Monty's 21st Group, but with the American flank already cleared to the Seine, von Kluge could do no more than withdraw to save whatever he could. Bradley, page 376. As our pincers neared Chambois the dewy morning of August 19, Montgomery called a meeting to coordinate his advance to the Seine with ours. We rendezvoused at a midway point between our CPs and retired with our mapboards to a mound of fresh-mown hay on the side of the road. Although by now we stood astride our overlord objective from Mantes Gaucourt to Orleans, the British had not yet closed to the Seine. Thinking to trap those units that had escaped through Falaise and at the same time break ground for the British advance, I suggested to Dempsey that he haul 2 British divisions through Avranches over Patton's path to the Seine and there strike north with a pincer up the left bank. "We'll get you the trucks to make the move," I promised, assuming that he would require aid on so long an overland haul. Bimbo pulled a straw through his teeth. "Oh, no thanks, Brad," he objected. "We couldn't pull it off. I just can't spare 2 divisions for so wide an end run." Rather than miss this opportunity for a second outside encirclement of the enemy west of the Seine, I propose that we turn our U.S. forces north into the British sector and cut the enemy off on the left bank. "If you can't do it, Bimbo," I said, "have you any objection to our giving it a try? It'll mean cutting across your front." "Why, no, not at all," he answered. "We'd be delighted to have you do it. I only wish we could find the troops to do it ourselves." Monty nodded in agreement. We anticipated beforehand that any such maneuver of U.S. troops across the British line of advance would entail an administrative headache, for the 80,000 troops that eventually marched up north would have to march back down again, this time across the British columns that in the meantime were closing to the Seine. Nevertheless, so anxious were we to bag the enemy fleeing eastward that we headed 4 divisions north up the left bank of the Seine. By August 25 they'd driven 35 miles across the British front to the vicinity of the Gothic city of Rouen. This unexpected maneuver panicked the enemy retreating before Montgomery's advance. Not only did we close off the Seine between Mantes Gaucourt and Rouen, but we forced the German into a narrow crossing on the north near the mouth of the Seine. As the German columns jammed up there behind the ferry crossings, Allied air rushed in to strafe and bomb them. And for 2 days our artillery fired on those concentrations until the crossings were marked by pyres of smoke that darkened the summer sky. Now Dempsey advanced with almost negligible resistance to occupy the front we'd cleared for him west of the Seine, and when he reached the river at Mantes Gasicourt, we presented him with a ready-made bridgehead. Then to withdraw our U.S. troops back across the British front, now heavily trafficked with east-west supply, Hodges and Dempsey agreed to a system of 2-hour clearances on all crossroads. The British and we were to pass our columns through these junctions for alternating periods of 2 hours each until our forces were unravelled. Several days later, when Dempsey was questioned by the British press on his advance to the Seine, he complained that the movement could have gone faster but for the U.S. traffic that snarled his front. Bradley, page 376-9. The plan for Overlord had been that Ike was to be the supreme commander, but Ike was required to use Monty as his deputy, and the agreement was that Monty had overall command of all ground armies in Normandy until such time that the American presence was large enough to give separate command to an American over the American armies. And instead of that being left to an arbitrary judgment, the deadline had been determined to be the 1st of September, which Monty had agreed to because he assumed that it would be easy to kill Hitler and wrap up the war by making terms with the Anglophile Remainers in the General German Staff within 90 days. Until the 1st of September, Monty was to decide the boundaries between the American and the British sectors, and Monty was also in charge of doling out supplies as well as picking all aerial bombing targets. And Monty personally directed the SAS, who were blowing up trains and carefully selected railroads, and Monty's chosen date to have accomplished his separate peace with the Germans had been the 1st of August, not simply to keep Patton out of the Normandy theatre as payback for the march to Messina, but because it also just so happened to be the same date that the Great War had kicked off 30 years earlier. When it neared time to transfer control of American troops over to an American commander as agreed to in Overlord, the British newspapers began reporting outrage that the Americans were threatening to steal command away from their beloved Monty. In response to the beginning of Dragoon, Monty ordered the French underground in Paris to rise up on the 19th of August, and Monty insisted that Patton turn around to rescue Paris, but Patton said that the city of Paris was a worthless objective and that Paris should be bypassed so that the battle towards the heart of Germany could continue. The German von Schultz was in command of Paris, and when Ike told Patton that British Bomber Command was going to bomb Paris, Patton sent a delegation in his Piper Cub to meet with von Schultz, and a surrender of Paris was signed, and Ike forced the British to call off the bombing. The stunning American victory on the 30th of July at Avranches while headed for Brest had been won with the help of the same French locals who would save Paris from being destroyed through their negotiations with von Schultz. And many of the French communists who would fire at Germans during the handover in Paris were actually the same British SAS who'd been working with the communists in Yugoslavia. When the French working with Patton convinced von Schultz not to burn down Paris, Hitler cut off food to the city, but the Parisians went out to the countryside on bicycles and brought back food to their countrymen, and Monty insisted that Paris was starving while the Americans knew that Paris could hold out until after Hitler was defeated. When Hitler had ordered the Germans to attack Patton at Mortain, von Kluge and other generals had begun planning a retreat towards Germany, but Hitler found out about it, and von Kluge was fired on the 15th of August, the same day Dragoon was launched. And von Kluge was replaced with Field Marshal Model, and von Kluge would kill himself on the 19th of August after Hitler had been given evidence from the British that von Kluge was one of the conspirators involved in Stauffenberg's July 20th assassination plot. and Hitler had also been given a list of all those German generals unwilling to cooperate with the British separate peace plan. Hitler had given orders to burn down the city of Paris when the British were stopped from bombing it. And Ike had been told there was an American presence already there, which is why the British Bomber Command had been forced to relent. Before the Germans left Paris, they placed tons of explosives around to destroy the city behind them, including the Eiffel Tower. But rumor had it that the Americans were in Rambouillet, only 30 miles away. There were 3 of them, and none of them had any real business being there. The first was a courtly Virginian named David Bruce, a colonel, brackets, later U.S. ambassador to Germany and Great Britain, close brackets. The second was a jeep driver, a taciturn GI named Red Pelkey from West Virginia. The third was a war correspondent. True to a promise sworn long before, Ernest Hemingway was leading the United States Press Corps to Paris. His first act had been to liberate the bar of the Hôtel du Grand Veneur. By the time Paris was liberated, in one of the most rapid promotions in French military history, he would be Mon Général. Sole liberators of this hunting preserve of the kings and presidents of France, and 48 hours ahead of the rest of the Allied armies, the trio found themselves saddled with an embarrassing problem: too many Germans. Every time we turned around, Bruce found, one was crawling out of the woodwork to surrender. Hemingway took away their pants and put them to work in the kitchen peeling potatoes for his growing band of FFI. Is Paris burning? How Paris miraculously escaped Adolf Hitler's sentence of death in August 1944 by Larry Collins and Dominique Lapierre, New York Pocket Cardinal edition. Simon & Schuster, 1965-1966, page 177 and 8. Patton had gone all the way to the Seine by the 21st of August, and his men were 35 miles north of Paris. And Monty wanted Patton to change direction and go back into Paris, where the Americans would certainly get stuck in the Liberation Party atmosphere. And then the Americans would be too busy hanging out with the French until Market Garden could end the war. But Patton ordered his American troops to pass through Paris on parade without stopping in their march towards the heart of Germany. On the sunny afternoon of August 29, the division's freshly scrubbed columns with loaded guns and full bandoliers swung down the Champs-Élysées from the Arc de Triomphe to the crowded Place de la Concorde. There, to the division's own tune of Khaki Bill, the procession parted into 2 columns, each moving into assembly preparatory to attack. What appeared to the Parisians to be a division on parade was actually a tactical movement into battle. Within 26 hours from the moment it had been alerted for this march, the division had scrubbed from its uniforms and trucks the encrusted dirt of 36 days in the line, issued instructions for the quote-unquote parade, and battle orders for the end of the line of march. Ike stayed away from Paris that day in a discreet effort to avoid offending the British, who might look on our parade as a stunt to carry favor with the French. Although we had invited Montgomery to join us, we were not surprised when he declined. Eisenhower's tact, though well-intentioned, did not mollify those Britishers who thought they had been snubbed. A section of the London press pounced upon our U.S. quote-unquote parade, as we feared it would, and branded it a deliberate affront to British prestige. Bradley, page 391. Monty had allowed Patton just enough supplies to get to Paris. And towards the end of the parade, a dozen snipers opened up on the crowds, the shooting done by unknown assailants hoping to panic the civilians into turning on the Americans for failing to protect them. But the American soldiers were locked and loaded and quickly fired back at the second floor of the building from where the shooting was coming, and the planned uprising quickly fizzled out. Monty had sent the Canadians into a strongly held German area 2 days earlier, on the 27th of August, where they took many casualties for 3 days before the Germans pulled back across the Seine 2 days later on the 30th of August, and Ike took command of all ground forces in the theater the following day, on the 1st of September. By the end of August, the American armies had suffered 125,000 casualties since D-Day, with 21,000 of them killed, and on the day of the power switch, Bradley started calling his headquarters Eagle, and when Monty heard this, he started calling his headquarters Lion. Bradley's plan was to send the American First towards Frankfurt south of the Ardennes, with Patton moving forward into Germany on the right flank of Hodge's First Army. But Monty's plan was for the American First and Ninth Armies to accompany him as Dominion troops northwards for his market garden, and Monty was calling it a quote-unquote single thrust into northern Germany, while Patton with his Third Army would be left down south in a holding position below the Ardennes, kept immobile there by a lack of supplies. Monty insisted that Patton go nowhere near Frankfurt, that was 90 miles southwest of Cologne, and Strasbourg was 100 miles south of Frankfurt. In recommending that Eisenhower devote all of his resources to this main effort, Montgomery suggested that Ike might bed Third Army down on the Meuse and there let Patton hold while he raced on to Berlin. The proposal was reminiscent of Monty's tactics during the Sicilian campaign, when he recommended the U.S. forces sit out the war on a defensive front while he went on alone to take Messina. Anticipating Eisenhower's eagerness to secure the Channel coast, I argued for a modified double thrust, one that would encompass the advantages of both British and American plans. Instead of assigning Hodge's entire First Army to Montgomery's advance, I would have Ike limit our support to a corps, enough, I contended, to keep Monty going. The remaining 2 corps of First Army would then team up with the Third in a direct thrust through the Saar toward the Rhine. Monty, however, declined this compromise. He demanded all of First Army. Bradley, page 394. In eyeing the advantages of this American plan, we did not overlook the possibility of reaching the Rhine to knock out the Saar and cut off barge traffic on that river. Bradley, page 395. There were 32 German divisions against the Americans, and growing stronger every day, and Monty continued to demand that the Americans go nowhere near the Rhine down south. And in withholding supplies to the Americans, Monty had set up extensive administrative posts to guard his Lend-Lease equipment and his gasoline stores, with duty officers to monitor compliance in keeping those supplies away from the Americans. As Monty trooped up the coast, he dropped off division after division to bottle up the enemy garrisons in Channel ports. By September 10, more than a third of his forces were pinned down to those rear area missions. On the other hand, I do believe that Monty could have delivered his thrust with less extravagance in tonnage. Initially, he maintained that he could not support 21st Army Group without fully stocked ammunition dumps. I argued strenuously with Eisenhower on Monty's extravagance in tonnage, but without success. To carry George on, we called on Troop Carrier for an emergency airlift. The lift started on August 23, but even this narrow margin of relief was soon to be denied us. For in the letter in which Eisenhower approved Montgomery's plan, he directed that airborne forces be used to clear a path for that northern thrust. A drop was to be made on Tournai, Belgium. Tournai, Belgium. A carpet manufacturing city 13 miles east of Lille. Eisenhower estimated that this airborne force would help pocket the enemy's 15th Army as it withdrew from the Pas-de-Calais. I pleaded with Ike to discard the scheme and leave us the aircraft for supply. The drop had been scheduled for September 3. "We'll be there before you can pull it," I warned. "When the paratroopers come down," I predicted, "they'll find us waiting on the ground." On the evening of September 2, a column of Hodges' tanks reached the outskirts of Tournai, within view of the 5 towers of its Cathedral of Notre Dame. Although Tournai lay beyond our boundary 6 miles in Montgomery's sector, I'd ordered Hodges to push in and take it. "I promised Ike we'd be there," I told him, "and I want to be sure that we are when I call him." At 5:15 on the morning of September 3, Hanson awakened me with a message from Monty, who complained that U.S. troops in Tournai were blocking the British road to Brussels. I called First Army and instructed the officer on duty in G3 to have them withdraw from the city. Bradley, page 396 and 7. On September 2, as his 7 Corps swarmed across the Belgian border in flank support of Monty's drive on Brussels, Collins pointed his troops towards Mons, where in 1914 the Kaiser's army had crashed headlong into the BEF. Approaching Mons from the North Sea coast were the disjointed elements of 20 German divisions, flushed by Monty from the Normandy beachhead and from the Pas-de-Calais. Fleeing en route towards the German frontier where it bulges into Belgium near Aachen, the enemy columns collided with Collins near the city of Mons. Neither had been forewarned of the approach of the other, and both stumbled into an unforeseen battle. By the time it ended, more than 2,000 of the enemy had been killed, and another 30,000 were packed off as prisoners to our cages. This collision at Mons had cost the enemy the last reserves of both his 7th and 15th armies, leaving the roads through Belgium virtually unblocked all the way to the Reich border. Not only had Hodges opened a path to Liège and beyond Liège to Aachen, but he'd destroyed a force the enemy desperately needed to man the empty fortifications of his Siegfried Line. It was this little-known victory at Mons that enabled First Army to break through the Siegfried Line and within 6 weeks take the city of Aachen. Bradley, page 401 and 2. Monty had been there at the Battle of Mons during the Great War, when his unit had been forced to retreat from Mons for 250 miles all the way to Paris, chased by the superior German army. And the Waterloo battlefield was 13 miles away from Mons. And British newspapers had reported during the Great War that the Battle of Mons was a great victory for Britain because they had finally stopped the Germans and saved the city of Paris. Mons was 30 miles east of Tournai, and Namur was 40 miles downriver from Mons. And the Battle of Mons had mythic status to the British as an unlikely victory against overwhelming odds. And Mons was as popular as the Battle of Agincourt that had taken place during the 100 Years' War in 1415 on the 25th of October, that had been a victory for Henry V that had crippled France. The Battle of Agincourt had been fought 30 miles south of Calais and had become the subject of Shakespeare's play Henry V. And Agincourt had been the beginning of a series of English victories on the battlefield and was fought in the exact same place where Monty had fought in the Great War for the Battle of Arras. Monty had also been at Passchendaele, or the Third Battle of Ypres, right across the trenches from Adolf Hitler. And after the Great War, Monty was sent to fight the Irish in County Cork, where he believed in harsh measures, after which he had started receiving promotions. Left behind at Arras were old quarries that had been refurbished during the Great War that could hold 13,000 men, and around Ronville were caves that had room for 12,000 men. And the British had used tunnelling companies during the war, comprised of Cornish tin miners and Welsh coal miners who dug underground facilities in many places in France and Belgium, where soldiers could come and go secretly from tunnels leading to these bunkers. The Australian, New Zealand, and Canadians had also sent miners until there were 30 tunnelling companies digging these underground storage facilities that had electricity and water and sewers and concealed bomb-proof doors, while the Germans were busy on the other side doing the same thing. The British had 25,000 coal miners digging, and twice that many soldiers being used as their labourers. And they built deep dugouts with 12 subways that were 25 feet underground. And the longest subway was over a mile long, and some of these underground tunnels had railway lines, and all of them had caverns off to the sides for storage. As the Great War progressed, these men were used to make more shallow tunnels where huge amounts of explosives could be set off underneath enemy positions, and some of these detonations were felt as far away as England. Henry V had claimed the title of the King of France because his great-grandfather Edward III had first made that claim, and Henry V had landed his army in France on the 13th of August in 1415 and marched them to the port of Calais. But the French had raised an army at Rouen, so Henry V met them on the river Somme at Agincourt on the 25th of October, and when the battle was over, Henry executed thousands of French prisoners and was received in triumph in London on the 23rd of November, while the Burgundians took advantage of the fallen French to march on Paris. In August of 1944, Rouen was in Monty's territory where the Germans had gone before Patton closed the Falaise pocket on the 21st of August after Luttich had ended in failure on the 13th. In the sector of 21st Army Group, a German general was captured in his staff car while rolling north as part of a British convoy. Mistaken for an officer of the RAF, the general had journeyed unmolested in a column of tanks, trucks, until collared by a bug-eyed MP. "And just where in blazes do you think you're going?" he asked. The German was headed toward the Somme, where he'd been ordered to organize a defense of that river line. He was told that the British had crossed the Somme 2 days before. Bradley, page 402. While leaving the British sector, the Americans ran into many German squads moving freely around and took them all prisoner, and Hitler was very unhappy that Monty's schemes to stop the Americans had failed, while too many German men and materials were being spent in Normandy that was desperately needed to fight the Russians in the east. Hitler was more than ready for the peace plan to go through that would get the British to get the Americans to help the Germans stop the Russians. And Hitler was furious with Monty since Epsom had failed, and Goodwood had failed, and Totalize had totally failed, and the incredible destruction of the French countryside in aerial bombing had failed to turn the population of France against the Americans. Now Market Garden simply had to work to bring America to its knees and force the world to recognize a justifiable negotiated peace between Britain and Germany, and Monty was insisting that it could be accomplished by Christmas. Himmler was sent ahead to Arnhem for the signing ceremony in Market Garden, and in Arnhem there was a weird white stateroom in the British Chief of Station headquarters awaiting Himmler's arrival, because Himmler had a fetish about white things and liked to dress all in white, and painted the walls of his office white with white carpeting and white chairs, and the secret room in Holland was completely white with white soundproofing, and the whole dirty business was described in gory detail in a book by a man named Charles Whiting called A Bridge at Arnhem, 1974. The Germans were furious that the international Jews had caused and were continuing to drive Hitler's war, so the Germans put extra pillars in their basements and dug tunnels between their houses in case their homes were bombed. And if Britain made a separate peace with Germany, then America would not be paid back for its Lend-Lease loans to England. So America had built up Russia so the Russians could defeat Germany. But Russia hadn't been getting the job done. So FDR sent the Americans over to finish the job, first to North Africa and then to Italy and then to France, because if the Russians made a separate peace with Germany, it would be very likely that the British would have had to quickly capitulate, and that would have left the Americans high and dry. The 11th Panzer Division tried to stop the Americans doing dragoon at Montreval on the 3rd of September, but they were unsuccessful. And the American 6th Corps reached Patton's 3rd Army on the 10th of September, while orders came down from Schaeff on the 14th of September for them all to halt because Monty was going to do Market Garden. Monty claimed to need not only all the available gas and ammo to do it, but also all of the Americans commanded by Hodges' 1st and Simpson's 9th Armies, and for lack of supplies to Patton, the 11th Panzer Division was able to retreat into the Vosges Mountains, west of Strasbourg, to be joined by 90,000 other German soldiers from all around southern France, while 90 British SAS parachuted into the Vosges Mountains for Operation Leuthen, and 1/3 of those SAS would be executed as soon as Market Garden failed. To the south, the 19th German Army under General der Infanterie Friedrich Wiese occupied the Colmar Pocket. This force, along with 2 SS Corps east of the Rhine, came under Army Group Oberrhein, commanded by none other than Reichsfuhrer Heinrich Himmler. The Bitter Woods, the dramatic story told at all echelons, from Supreme Command to squad leader, of the crisis that shook the Western Coalition, Hitler's surprise Ardennes offensive, by John S.D. Eisenhower, New York, Da Capo Press, G.P. Putnam's Sons, 1969, page 394. As Patton continued to push on in the face of a gasoline shortage that theoretically should have stopped him somewhere on the Meuse, Montgomery accused me of having hedged on Ike's orders to grant top priority to Hodges. Bradley, page 399. Meanwhile, up north, as soon as the Americans had surrounded half of Aachen, they also began starving for supplies in September, as the priority was given to Market Garden. And some historians said that Hitler had first announced to his generals his plans for the Battle of the Bulge on the 16th of September. Monty had Schaeff tell Ike to tell the Americans to pause on September 11 before reaching Aachen, but they went ahead and completely surrounded Aachen by calling it a probe rather than merely pausing. And they did that because on September 11, the Dragoon forces from southern France had joined up with 3rd Army in a continuous front, and they no longer had to follow Monty's orders to get resupplied. Aachen had been Charlemagne's capital, and Charlemagne had been the founder of the First German Reich, and Aachen was where 31 Holy Roman Emperors had been crowned until the godless Napoleon had marched through Europe and put an end to the Holy Roman Empire, and Hitler was intent on bringing it back. The Holy Roman Empire had lasted over 1,000 years, until the 6th of August in 1806, when the Habsburgs abdicated their title of Holy Roman Emperor, so Napoleon, with his waterfall of victories, could not become the next anointed one. And Napoleon's brilliant move in 1806 had been to send his army north and then order them to retreat in pretended weakness, encouraging the enemy to attack down south, and Napoleon had deliberately thinned his right flank to tempt the enemy to attack. Russia and Prussia had made peace with Napoleon in the Treaty of Tilsit that began an alliance that held sway over much of Europe, and Napoleon's France had pledged to help Russia against Ottoman Turkey in exchange for Russia joining the continental system against the British Empire. The Treaty of Tilsit in 1807 had been the result of the Battle of Friedland in Königsberg, and Königsberg was the ancient sacred capital of Prussia from way back in the days of the Teutonic Knights. And the Battle of the Kurland Pocket in 1944 would result from the Germans trying to save this nucleus of the fatherland at Königsberg. When the Russians had made peace with Napoleon at Königsberg, the British swore to never forgive them, because it had taken another 7 years to finally defeat the French without Russia's help. Aachen had been given to Prussia at the Congress of Vienna in 1814, and Prussia had been offered the territory of Hanover to stay out of the Third Coalition, while Napoleon had been telling Britain they could have Hanover as part of a peace proposal, and Aachen was only 20 miles away from Liège, where the Americans were busy building the largest supply dump of Hitler's war. Aachen was 90 miles west of Mons and 60 miles north of Bastogne, and the Treaty of Aachen, signed in 1668, had been the result of fighting between France and the Austrian Habsburg Spanish Netherlands, and the disputed territory had included Mons, Tournai, and Dinant. And the Habsburg Spanish Netherlands had belonged to the Holy Roman Empire from 1556 to 1714, and its capital had been at Brussels. The Treaty of Utrecht, signed in Holland in 1713, was the result of a separate peace negotiated after the British abandoned their Dutch allies on the battlefield, leaving them at the mercy of the other swindled ally, Austria. England was now riven in twain upon the issue of peace. A separate peace it must be now, for the Allies, one and all, repudiated the right of the British government to abandon the alliance and provide for themselves. In that haughty, fierce society of London and of Europe no agreement was possible. Upon a dark day the British army, hitherto the most forward in the Allied cause and admired by all, marched away from the camp of the Allies in bitter humiliation and amid the curses of their old comrades. Only a handful of the British-paid allies would go with them. Although deprived of their pay and arrears, the great majority declared they would fight on for the common cause. Many of Marlborough's veterans flung themselves on the ground in shame and fury. The outraged Dutch closed the gates of their cities in the face of the deserting ally. Churchill's History of the English-Speaking Peoples, arranged by Henry Steele Commager. New York, Pocketbook, Simon & Schuster, 1966, page 93 and 4. As soon as the British House of Hanover was brought into being, their Queen Anne's War went on for 11 years and ended with Britain taking Canada away from the French and taking Gibraltar away from the Spanish, and the House of Hanover's first wars, ending with the 1713 Treaty of Utrecht, was signed 30 miles away from Arnhem, where Monty was now headed for his Operation Market Garden. Switching sides in the middle of a war was a time-tested tactic for the British. And the John Churchill of Marlborough, who'd won Queen Anne's War, had been made the first Duke of Marlborough for his great military victory that brought about the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713. And the first Duke of Marlborough's father had been named Winston Churchill. And the Winston Churchill who was wanting to make a separate peace with Germany in 1944 was a direct descendant of these Marlborough Churchills, and had written a book about his ancestor, the first Duke of Marlborough Churchill, that was 4 volumes long, a history that Churchill had started writing in 1933 and had completed in 1938. The first Duke of Marlborough, Churchill, had fought for the Catholic English King James II, and then switched sides to fight against him to help the Dutch Orange William invade England, but secretly had tried to get James II back in power, and when Orange William found out about this double-dealing and betrayal, he fired Marlborough Churchill, not for the side-switching, but for misusing public money. The House of Hanover pardoned Marlborough Churchill first thing, and Churchill in 1933 had taken pains to make Marlborough an heroic figure, and had credited him with the very creation and founding of the House of Hanover. On September 16, 1701, James II died. The maritime powers had scarcely a friendly port beyond their coasts. The New World, except in the north, was barred against them. The Mediterranean had become in effect a French lake. South of Plymouth no fortified harbour lay open to British and Dutch ships. They had their superior fleets, but no bases which would carry them to the inland sea. William died at 52, worn out by his labours. Marlborough, at the same age, strode forward against tremendous odds upon the 10 years of unbroken victory which raised the British nation to a height in the world it had never before attained. The age of Anne is rightly regarded as the greatest manifestation of the power of England, when in March 1702 Anne ascended the throne. She accepted Marlborough's impulse upon the whole policy of the state. In the first momentous days of her reign, he was not only her chief but her sole guide. Both main parties admired him in a blaze of loyalty. It was the quote-unquote sunshine day for which the Princess Anne had long waited, but all fell into Marlborough's hands. Churchill's History, page 34 through 41. By 1740, the House of Hanover had entrenched itself in Silesia, and the British told Maria Theresa that they would give her beloved Silesia back to her, but they gave it to her enemy Prussia instead, when Britain won the War of the Austrian Succession, even though they'd been allied with Maria Theresa. The House of Hanover's George II had just beaten Frederick II the Great, who would come back 8 years later for round 2, and there'd been an elaborate ceremony at Aachen in 1748 to sign the treaty making Silesia a Prussian territory that would help Frederick II the Great to prosper into a great power, even though he'd just been beaten by the British House of Hanover. Frederick II the Great came back for his round 2 in 1756, and the war over Silesia reappeared as the 7 Years' War, or Third Silesian, but this time it would be Prussia and George II of Britain against everyone else. And at the end of the 7 Years' War, the peace treaty signed in Versailles in Paris in 1763 added £75 million to the British national debt. The House of Hanover's George II claimed to have started the 7 Years' War to protect his ancestral homeland of Hanover, which was the north coast of Germany between Holland and Hamburg, all the way down to Nordhausen, just east of the Ruhr. The very first Treaty of Aachen had been in the year 803, between Charlemagne and the Byzantine emperor from Constantinople, that decided the border between the Franks and the Turks at the lovely port of Trieste. And Charlemagne had won Trieste away from what was left of Rome. When Charlemagne died at the age of 72, he was buried in the cathedral he'd built at Aachen. And Frederick I, who was called Barbarossa, canonized Charlemagne several hundred years later and opened his tomb and reburied Charlemagne under the floor of the cathedral. And Frederick II the Great dug Charlemagne up again and put him in a coffin made of silver and gold. When the British allied with Austria for Maria Theresa's war in 1740, They used the same battlefields that would host the sequel 8 years later in the 7 Years' War of 1756 to 1763. But this time, Britain had switched sides to fight alongside Frederick II the Great, who was at war with Austria. And the British had learned in 1748 where all the Austrian supply dumps and troops were stationed. When the 7 Years' War ended, all the other countries except Britain were exhausted from having been at war for 62 years ever since the founding of the House of Hanover, and that left Britain in 1763 the uncontested ruler of the seas and the foremost colonial power. Maria Theresa spoke German, and her husband had come from Lorraine, where Metz was. And Metz was where Patton was marching forward against written orders. And the 1740 War of the Austrian Succession had lost Maria Theresa's ancestral lands of Silesia, even though she'd won the war. And Maria Theresa had come out the loser for having allied herself with the British. Now, instead of Britain and Austria fighting Spain, France, and Prussia, the 1756 7 Years' War would be Britain and Prussia fighting Spain, France, and Austria, and it would go on for 7 years while the British used their insider knowledge of Austrian military positions to cripple Austria's allies, France and Spain, two countries who had made themselves at home in America. The British Prime Minister imposed the Stamp Act on the American colonies in 1765 to pay for the 7 Years' War. And most of the American Indians sided with the French in America against the British, which is why the 7 Years' War was also called the French and Indian Wars. And the Americans did not agree that beating the French in Canada had anything to do with Americans, who got along fine with their French friends. The Stamp Act failed, and 2 years later the Crown tried the Revenue Act that taxed tea and 5 other items brought over on English ships, and when the Americans quit buying these English goods, the tax was lightened to tea only in 1770, and 3 years later the Americans painted themselves like Indians and invited themselves aboard some English ships to dump tea into the Boston harbor. The British had sent over a huge supply of tea to sell cheaply at a loss, hoping to put the American beverage companies out of business. And when the underpriced tea went into the drink, the Crown responded by taking away the Americans' charter. The Americans congressed and wrote a Declaration of Rights demanding that the Crown, emphasis, restore their rights as good English colonists. End emphasis. But the Crown refused, and the Don't Tread on Me and the Liberty flag were unfurled, and the American War of Independence got underway. The British Parliament considered a reconciliation bill in 1778 to grant restoration of the rights of the Americans, but because the French had jumped in on the side of the colonists in America as payback for the 7 Years' War, and because the Americans had welcomed the French as friends, the British decided that they hated Americans as much as they hated the French, and then Spain joined in with France, so Britain was alone against all of Europe, but they had only themselves to blame. The British surrendered to the Americans at Yorktown, and were made to sign the Treaty of Versailles in 1783, where Florida was given to Spain as a thank you. And the French would stage a revolution of their own against the nobility and its unbearable taxes in 1789. And when France was recovering from the Napoleonic Wars that naturally followed their attempt to overturn rule of the nobility in France, the American South found out that Britain would not help them simply in order to buy cotton, but because they hoped that by splitting up the American states, the Crown could maintain its place as the most powerful country in the world, and from there be able to fulfill their dream of making the King of England also the King of France. Thomas Paine had written a detailed plan to get rid of poverty in Europe by creating a republican government that would better distribute tax dollars that were now being spent in Britain, quote, conducting wars and paying pensions to members of the aristocracy, close quote. The Rights of Man by Tom Paine, 1791, dedicated to George Washington by Mr. Paine, from Tom Paine and Revolutionary America by Eric Foner, New York, Oxford University Press, 1976, page 218. Jefferson thought that government should be in the business of protecting people's rights, and that the pursuit of happiness was most important, because that is what life, liberty, and property were for. And somebody sent Jefferson a pre-copy of Paine's Rights of Man, and Jefferson wrote a letter back that they used as a preface. The Americans wrote the Declaration of Independence from ideas they'd gotten from Frenchmen like Rousseau. And the American writer Tom Paine went over well in France, and the French helped Washington win the war by smuggling in supplies. The French had been too busy fighting with the British in 1763 in America and India to be able to be of much help to Maria Theresa in the 7 Years' War. And during that war, George Washington had been an officer in the British Army in America. The French finally lost, and French Canada was given to Britain, and Britain got rid of the French in India and in the West Indies. And the British had become the ruler of the seas after the 7 Years' War because they'd been helping the Muslims fight Russians in the Black Sea, keeping Russia from being able to help her friend France. The Russians had been fighting Muslims for a very long time, ever since the scourge of Islam invaded Constantinople. And in Moldavia in 1770, an army of 40,000 Russians fought 75,000 Muslims, many of whom were Janissary children stolen from their European parents and forced to become Muslims. And then the children were made to fight for the Islamic Ottomans. 3/5 of the Muslims in Moldavia were on horseback, but were defeated by the smaller Russian army. And the Russians lost only 1,000 men, while the Muslims lost 20,000 killed or wounded, and 1/3 of the Ottoman Muslims had been drowned in the Danube trying to escape. Prussia and Britain had both stepped in to help the Muslims during the 7 Years' War. And Catherine the Great had been forced to give up half of Poland, but was allowed to keep her important ports in the Crimea on the Black Sea that she had freed from Moslem occupation. And Catherine the Great had won back the entire Crimea the same month that Britain was blockading Boston Harbor to punish the Americans for the Boston Tea Party. The Crown was demanding that the Americans pay damages to the British East India Company for the loss of their tea, and the other American colonies started sending supplies overland to Boston to defeat the British blockade. And providing this relief to Boston unified the American colonies, and that unity would allow them to win in the upcoming war against the British. Catherine the Great spent 6 months enjoying the Crimea with her friend the Austrian Holy Roman Emperor, who was the eldest son of Maria Theresa and the brother of Marie Antoinette. And the following year, the Muslims attacked again but were beaten back by the Russians with the help of the Austrians, forcing the Ottoman Muslims to sign the Treaty of Jassy in 1792, and with that, Austria won back Belgrade in Yugoslavia. The Russian border with the Muslims was pushed back all the way to the Dniester River, freeing the Ukrainians from the scourge of Islam. And Catherine the Great named a port on the coast of the Black Sea Odessa in honor of the Polish king of the Kievan Rus, who had inherited that port from the Greeks, and its Greek name had been Odessa, before the Battle of Varna in 1444, during the Crusades that had lost the Ukraine to the Muslims, a crucial defeat that had set up the fall of Constantinople in 1453. The Ottomans would murder all the Janissaries in 1826, prompting the Russians to return to take care of more business with the Islamists. And Russia would try again to save the Christians in Constantinople in 1877, but the British sent the fleet to oppose them. And when the British withdrew from Afghanistan 4 years later in 1881 because they were stretched too thin, having to defend their bases in Egypt and Cyprus and Malta and Gibraltar, the Kaiser sent the gunboat Panther in 1911 to Agadir in Morocco to help the French keep the British out of French Morocco in North Africa. When Britain sued for peace 7 years later, on the 11th of November in 1918, they claimed that the Crown didn't want to ruin Germany so that reparations might be exacted in order to pay America for having saved the Crown from suffering the same fate as Austria, Russia, Germany, Italy, and France, who were no longer being guided by the superior wisdom and experience of nobility. Meanwhile, in the New World, America didn't have schools for all the people living on farms, and while the government had tried to build schools for everyone, the kids on farms had been left out, and so they'd been growing up exceptionally independent, and the Depression further taught them to do much with little. Most of America's farm kids had been used to having shoes only to wear in the winter, and so the provisions given them by Uncle Sam to fight Hitler were certainly a godsend, and they were sent over to Europe, better equipped than any other soldier in the world, unbeatably outfitted with everything they would need to stop the super soldiers of the German army. While the food might have been better back home, the young men fresh off America's farms appreciated the clothing and equipment given them for fighting in Hitler's war. And from their experience fixing the recalcitrant farm equipment of the 30s, they had what it took to make that army equipment work. Aachen had been declared a free imperial city of the Holy Roman Empire in 1166 by Frederick I, who was called Barbarossa. And Aachen was 80 miles away from Antwerp. And from Aachen, a mere 35 miles further into Germany, was the holy city of Cologne on the Rhine. And in September of 1944, Monty was insisting that no Americans cross the Rhine any further south than Cologne. Hodges reported that he now had on hand ammunition for 5 days' fighting and gasoline enough to carry him to the Rhine. On the basis of his current allocation of supply, Hodges estimated that he could support 10 days of strenuous fighting on his 120-mile First Army front. Patton reported 4 days of ammunition and enough gasoline to roll on to the Rhine. 5 days before, Montgomery had complained that this diversion of gasoline to Patton had slowed Hodges in his First Army advance on the right flank of the British. But while Courtney admitted that gasoline shortages might have cost his army a day's advance, he attributed the delay to difficulty in bridging the Meuse and to a noticeable stiffening of enemy opposition. Bradley, page 406 and 7. On the southern front below the Ardennes forest, Patton's 80th Division had established a bridgehead across the Moselle between Metz and Nancy. But enemy resistance had suddenly grown heavier, and George found his crossings strongly opposed as he sought to widen the beachhead. On September 12, Patton had finally reached the end of his tether. Bradley, page 408. Throughout the night of September 11, confusion, anxiety, and gloom paraded ostentatiously around the headquarters of the German 7th Army, hastily set up in a brick barracks near a little town 23 miles inside the Eifel. Hardly had night fallen when the bad news reached the army commander. The disaster everybody had been predicting for days, General der Panzertruppen Erich Brandenberger learned, had come to pass. The 2nd Panzer Division, withdrawing hurriedly from Belgium and Luxembourg to occupy pillboxes and bunkers of the West Wall, had found the Americans already there. Battle of the Hürtgen Forest by Charles B. MacDonald, New York. Great Battles of History series. Hanson W. Baldwin, editor. Modern Literary Editions Publishing Company. Curtis Books, J.B. Lippincott Company. 1963, page 21. The footnote read, "To simplify identification, references to bodies of German troops are printed in italics." To simplify identification, references to bodies of German troops are printed in italics. General Brandenberger's strongest corps was Schock's 81st Corps astride the Aachen Gap. Of 4 seriously weakened divisions, the 2 defending the West Wall north of Aachen would gain a few days' respite while the 19th U.S. Corps was coming forward. Nominally, the 81st Corps had 2 other units, but one, a Panzer Brigade, had lost most of its tanks in front of the West Wall early on September 11, and the other early arrivals included 2 artillery batteries, but no tanks. It seemed to Schock that his best chance for preventing a breakthrough until help arrived would be to concentrate his greatest strength before what he considered to be the immediate American objective, the city of Aachen. Hope that help might arrive in time to prevent an American breakthrough suddenly blossomed soon after daylight on the 12th. From Hitler himself came word that he had earmarked 2 infantry divisions for early transfer to Field Marshal Model's Army Group B. Model promptly scheduled both for Brandenberger's 7th Army. This was all the encouragement Brandenberger needed. An indefatigable man who threw himself with fierce enthusiasm into his work, Brandenberger began to move like an impulsive machine. A fortress battalion shifted here, 2 fleeing anti-tank guns turned around and thrown in there. Advance contingents of the 12th Infantry Division, Brandenberger told them, were to entrain in East Prussia at midnight, September 13, under priority orders from the Führer himself. With any luck from the weather to screen the trains from Allied planes, first arrivals might show up in less than 3 days. Unfortunately for the Germans, 3 days might be too late, for General Schock's opposite on the American side, Joe Collins of the 7th Corps, had no intention of attacking where Schock anticipated. Undistracted by the glory of capturing Aachen, birthplace of the Emperor Charlemagne, capital of the Holy Roman Empire, site of the coronation of 32 emperors and kings, Collins saw the primary objective as the penetration of the Siegfried Line, and the place to do that was south of Aachen, between the city and the Hürtgen Forest. Battle of the Hürtgen Forest, page 32 and 4. But in reality, the genius of German production still was on his side. Despite round-the-clock bombings of unprecedented magnitude, the Germans had been able to maintain an incredibly high rate of production. In September, for example, some 25 new submarines, most of which were equipped with the Schnorkel underwater breathing device, would be launched. Also in September, German factories would begin to redress the balance in aircraft, and new jet-propelled planes promised for early delivery soon might offset any remaining imbalance. In regard to tanks, Hitler as early as June had acted to narrow the gap between German and Allied armored strength by concentrating on models tactically superior to the Allied mainstay, the American Sherman tank. In August, in addition to the 279 medium tanks that came off the assembly line, 455 heavy tanks were also built. Priority on the new, more powerful tanks went to the west, where 10 new Panzer brigades were being equipped, each built around a tank battalion. Creation of these brigades was one of several steps that Hitler had begun to take to bolster manpower as well as build up equipment in the West. During the summer, he had already raised 15 new divisions. Battle of the Hürtgen Forest, page 27. General Schmidt, a man who bore the same name as 9th Division's objective, became responsible for the entire Hürtgen Forest. Battle of the Hürtgen Forest, page 98. Both German forces counterattacked sharply, but this time it was the Germans and not the Americans who were exposed to lethal tree bursts and the confusions of the forest. As American artillery roared, the Germans fell back in disorder, leaving behind a pitiful profusion of dead and wounded. The 3 days of renewed fighting in the Hürtgen Forest, culminating in the carnage of the two counterattacks, convinced Hans Schmidt that he faced an enemy with an unlimited supply of fresh troops and specially trained and experienced in forest fighting. He asked the Corps Commander General Straub for help. Straub in turn telephoned General Brandenberger, but the army commander was less concerned about the threat in the woods than that posed by the attack of 19 Corps north of Aachen. Brandenberger, fully occupied with seeking reserves to build a dike around the hole in the west wall, proffered General Schmidt 2 fortress infantry battalions, which the insatiable forest quickly chewed up. Blazing cannon and machine guns on the tanks pinned the Germans to their foxholes and cellars, except for a lone lieutenant who dared to rise and fire a Panzerfaust at the lead tank. Though the rocket hit the turret of the tank, slightly wounding the tank commander, the crew quickly turned its 75mm piece on the lieutenant. With one round, the big gun ripped the German officer in two. This so demoralized the other Germans that most of them either surrendered or fled. Nearly 100 were soon on their way back to prisoner compounds. Battle of the Hürtgen Forest, page 116 and 18. During the night of October 11, trucks carrying 1,200 men of an ad hoc force called Regiment Wegeline rolled north from a quiet sector along the Luxembourg border. Commanded by a colonel from whom the unit drew its name, Regiment Wegeline had an unusually large complement of machine guns and mortars. The men were young and well-trained, with half of them tabbed as candidates for officers' school. Regiment Wegeline, Brandenberger ordered, was to attack south through the woods west of Wittscheid and cut off the American penetrations at Gurmeter and north of Wassenach. Unhappily for the Germans, Regiment Wegeline failed to complete its move over the winding blackout Eifel roads until well after midnight. The commander, Colonel Wolfgang Wegeline, urged General Schmidt to allow him to delay his attack, at least until he could lay telephone lines to assure adequate artillery support. But Schmidt refused. To Schmidt it was obvious that the Americans were poised to take Wassenach. Once they held the Wassenach Ridge, he believed they would turn north against the road net at Hürtgen. Regiment Wegeline would have to attack at once, Schmidt insisted, or all chance to cut them off would be lost. The first indication the 39th Infantry had of impending counterattack came at 7 o'clock the morning of the 12th in the form of a brief but sharp artillery preparation. Firing machine guns, burp guns, and rifles, the Germans of Regiment Wegeline charged through the early morning light across a shallow draw that fronted the hastily organized positions west of Wittscheid. In a matter of minutes, the first wave poured through an overextended American line and surged across the trail leading into Gurmeter, the lifeline of Thompson's 1st Battalion. Though Thompson hurriedly turned 2 of his companies against the penetration, the depleted units were too weak to force the Germans back. The regimental commander, Colonel Bond, had no reserve to call on, nor could the division commander, General Craig, do much to help. About all there was left for either Bond or Craig was to urge the division artillery on to greater efforts in pounding the woods whence the Germans came. Unknown to the Americans, all was far from right on the German side. Colonel Wegelein's communications had failed utterly, so that he himself knew little about what was taking place, as did Bond and Craig. What was more, Wegelein was left with no way to control his artillery. Though his troops had penetrated the American positions, they had not eliminated them, for here and there American groups held out in stubborn little pockets of resistance. Night passed in the Hürtgen forest with confusion reigning on both sides. Firing at various points erupted spasmodically as men of one force or the other bumped into an adversary or imagined they did. Meanwhile, General Schmidt ordered Colonel Wegelein to renew the counterattack the next morning, but this became impossible when an order arrived that all officer candidates in Regiment Wegelein were to be withdrawn. This cut Wegelein's strength in half and took away his most effective fighters. By mid-afternoon on October 13, Colonel Bond had sufficient control over his regiment to begin the job of eliminating the German penetration. It nevertheless took 3 days. The German commander, Colonel Wegelein, himself became a casualty in the closing days of the engagement. As he was walking, alone and unarmed, not far from his foxhole, a sergeant from Company E shot him. On his body were maps and detailed plans for Regiment Wegelein's counterattack. For a German officer who had served efficiently since 1921, this parading alone and unarmed through the forest close to American lines was strange behavior. Had Wegelein become so disillusioned with the failure and destruction of his unit that he courted death? Or was it that Wegelein, like so many others in the thick forest, had simply lost his way? Battle of the Hürtgen Forest, page 126 through 30. Not until the morning of December 5, 2 days after Brandenburg fell, did CCR's 2nd Task Force, brackets, Combat Command Reserve of the 1st Armored Division, close brackets, finish clearing the quote-unquote rubble pile at Foseneck and become available to help at Bergstein. While tank destroyers provided overhead fire from commanding positions in Brandenburg, the tanks and armored infantry struck in 3 columns. In a matter of minutes, they raced across the half-mile of open ground between the 2 villages and gained the first houses in Bergstein. There followed a methodical mop-up that ended only after dark, when all the rubble of Bergstein was in hand. In hand, yes, but cruelly exposed to counterattack should the Germans strike back, for the best efforts of the depleted American infantry battalions still had left great stretches of forest on north, south, and east of Bergstein to the Germans. Also remaining to the Germans was a dominating wooded height at the eastern edge of the village, Berg or Castle Hill. Neither CCR nor the 8th Division had anybody to send to take this hill. The combat command was now down to 400 men, including the crews of 6 remaining tank destroyers and 16 tanks, and every man of the 8th Division, including the Division Engineer Battalion, was in a foxhole somewhere. The counterattacks began before dawn the next morning, December 6. Supported by 5 tanks, men of the 272nd Volksgrenadier Division used the darkness to gain access to the village. Here the fight raged at close quarters. Only with the coming of daylight was CCR able to bring its superior armor strength to bear. The Germans fell back, but they continued to chew at the village all day long with artillery and assault gun fire directed from Castle Hill, and twice more they tried to come out of the woods to storm the village. As night came, the condition of CCR raised grave doubts whether the armor could continue to hold so long as the Germans retained the dominating height of Castle Hill. Tanks in the combat command now numbered only 7, or just over a platoon. To Corps Commander General Garrow, Wild Bill Weaver appealed for help. Garrow in turn gained approval from the First Army's General Hodges to commit a special unit, the 2nd Ranger Battalion, to seize Castle Hill the next morning before daylight. An elite force specially trained for hazardous missions such as taking a line of cliffs overlooking the invasion beaches in Normandy. The Ranger Battalion, in a night attack, quickly swept the tree-crowned crest of Castle Hill. Holding it was another matter, particularly in the face of incessant German shelling, most of which burst in the treetops. By the time, 2 days later, that General Weaver was able to adjust his lines and free an infantry battalion to defend the hill, the Rangers were down to 1/4 of their original strength. Obliged to release the men of the Volksgrenadier Division for the counter-offensive, General Brandenberger of the 7th Army now had no choice but to abandon his efforts to retake the ridge. Heterogeneous small units still would make a fight of it, as infantry of the 8th Division sought to clear the woods down to the waters of the Roer, but by nightfall on December 8, the worst was over. Battle of the Hürtgen Forest, page 280 and 82. The town of Schmidt was named after the family who had once lived in the county, and the only secure road from Cologne to Aachen went through Schmidt. So Hitler was certain that General Schmidt would defend it as though it were his own home, since it was. The county of Brandenburg surrounding Castle Hill was being defended by General Brandenberger, and the Hürtgen Forest was on the southern edge of Aachen and completely protected the city. The Ardennes Forest was 40 miles farther south, and the Germans had an advantage in the Hürtgen Forest because a large portion of German equipment was still being drawn by horses.